Sad, really, isn't it? People spend all their time making nice things and other people come along and break them.
Any fan of the original Doctor Who television series knows that one of the saddest chapters in the show's history is the loss of nearly 100 early black and white episodes of the show. Thankfully, however, just because the original episodes are lost, it doesn't mean we can't still experience them, and one of the best ways to do that is on the BBC's range of narrated soundtrack CDs. Narrated soundtracks of classic Doctor Who episodes existed long before this range, of course. In 1965, the final episode of The Chase was released on 7-inch vinyl, with additional narration by David Graham under the title The Daleks.
The cable's strong. It wouldn't break.
I think it's the only chance we've got.
Well, I don't like it. Look!
There was now no time to argue. From the window of the prison, they looked across the top of the elevator shaft and saw the Daleks.
Later in 1979, an abridged version of Genesis of the Daleks was released on LP, with additional linking narration by Tom Baker.
I stepped from the TARDIS onto a bleak planet. All around, the ground was ravaged. No vegetation. Banks of chilling fog swirling through the air. Why had I been brought here?
Despite audio copies of the missing episodes circulating among fans for many years, albeit in varying quality, it wasn't until 1992 that the BBC issued their own official releases of any of these stories. And the results weren't to everybody's tastes. The narration scripts were at times underwritten, and in the case of the final 2 releases, having Tom Baker narrate the story in character as if the Fourth Doctor was remembering an old adventure was just distracting. These cassettes weren't entirely unsuccessful, and they showed that a market was there for these stories on audio, but a bit of a rethink was going to be needed if the project was to continue. In 1999, a second range of missing episode audios was launched, one that was to have a much longer lifespan than its predecessors, and that's the one we're going to look at today. Now, for whatever reason, the decision was made to start this new range, not with a Dalek or Cyberman story as you might expect, but instead a historical story. And not just any historical story, but one of the most challenging in the show's history. It's difficult to know nearly 20 years after the fact what exactly was going through the minds of the people responsible for selecting these initial releases. There is a lovely article over on the Doctor Who Restoration Team website detailing the challenges facing Sue Cowley as she struggled to write the narration script, but it doesn't cast any light on just why the Massacre of all stories was chosen to launch this new range. I'm probably wrong, but I've always believed that the choice of the Massacre was meant to send a message to Doctor Who fans, and that message was that this range, unlike the others, was going to endure. The Daleks, the Cybermen, all the rest of that stuff, it's all coming, but we're going to release the Massacre first, and we're going to trust that you guys want all these stories badly enough that you'll support it. It was a gamble that could very well have seen the range stumble at the first hurdle, but instead, the result was a resounding success. The narrated soundtrack release of The Massacre was extremely well received, and in May 2000, well, here comes the first of those classic monster stories we know you all really love. This became the pattern for the next 4 years. 4 or 5 stories would be released annually, in no particular order, but generally alternating between the first and second Doctors. Legendary classics stood side by side with less well-regarded stories, and in my opinion, this random schedule was exactly the right way to release these stories, because it made every release an event. Much like the DVD releases later on, each story got its own turn in the spotlight, for better or worse. By May 2004, every story that was more than 50% missing from the television archives was available to listen to on CD. My own experience with the range begins around this time. I had been getting into Doctor Who on audio via Big Finish, and I had also had the Ice Warriors VHS box set, which included the missing second and third episodes on CD. In fact, I think I may have listened to that CD more than I watched the tape. I was strange then, I still am. Anyway, in 2003 I started commuting to and from university. I needed things to listen to on the hour's bus ride in and out every day, and in 2004 I decided to pick up a copy of the Fury from the Deep narrated soundtrack. Now, I was used to hearing soundtracks of television shows, comedy shows like Blackadder or Yes Minister translated very well to audio, especially if they were dialogue heavy, but those were comedies. Adapting a television drama series to audio was a very different proposition, especially a science fiction series. Based on the Ice Warriors CD, which hadn't been the easiest listen, I couldn't see how these new releases could work, and honestly, I wasn't expecting to get much out of this. Surely, no matter how much the soundtrack had been cleaned up, and even with narration, this couldn't be any kind of substitute for a missing story, could it? Boy, was I wrong.
Tendrils of seaweed begin to snake through the vents, writhing and twisting, coming closer, reaching for her.
It literally took just a couple of minutes for me to completely fall in love with this range. Now, the fact that Fury from the Deep is such a good story certainly helped, but I think I would have had this reaction with almost any other story. The soundtrack and the narration fitted together perfectly. I couldn't see the visuals, but crucially, I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything by experiencing the story this way either. The narration plugged all of the visual gaps. It felt like a complete experience, and I honestly came away from that first listening feeling like I really had just seen Fury from the Deep for the very first time. And after that, I just had to have them all. I couldn't help it. If I saw one on a shop shelf, I bought it there and then, and I enjoyed every single one of them. Except Galaxy 4. And the Celestial Toymaker. They're not very good. And for Christmas that year, I got two of my favourite releases from this range. The Faceless Ones and the Daleks Master Plan. The 5-disc set of the Daleks Master Plan may well be my favourite piece of Doctor Who merchandise ever produced. Not because it's the best story or anything, but because it's obviously such a labour of love, and it's one that, just a few years earlier, we would have had no right to expect. If you go back to the Restoration Team website, there's an article there by Mark Ayres about the arduous process of putting together the very best possible soundtrack from multiple sources, and as frustrating as that must have been for him, it's a perfect example of why this range was such a success. The BBC could have just slapped these soundtracks onto CD with the bare minimum of effort. They'd done it before, after all. But they didn't have to do that this time. Talented people who cared, gave their time and energy to making these releases the very best they could be, and I think that really shows in the final product. 2004 also saw a necessary shift in the focus of the range. By now, every story that was completely or mostly missing was available on CD, so it only made sense to move on to the other mostly complete stories, ones that only had an episode or two missing. And also in November 2004 came Lost in Time, a DVD set collecting all of the episodes from stories that were more than half missing. This collection of orphan episodes once again highlighted the gaps in the show's history, but also served as a pointer towards the narrated soundtrack range for those who were interested in filling in the blanks. Doctor Who's 40th anniversary the previous year had seen a resurgence of interest in the show, and the CD range was now doing better than ever. This was also the point where the range began to include regular bonus features. Up until now, such things had been a rarity. We'd had the occasional continuity announcement if it was present on the recording, and the Marco Polo release had even come with a separate map showing the journey made by Polo's caravan. From now on though, almost every release had an interview with the actor that had narrated the story, and that was at minimum. We could also expect archive clips, news reports relevant to occurrences in the historical stories, and even the complete Ballad of the Last Chance Saloon. Yay! With the release of The Reign of Terror in 2006, every single missing episode of Doctor Who had now been released on CD. The long mission was at last at an end, and this was a natural point to call it a day. Oh, but heck, why stop there? Narrated soundtrack releases of stories that existed complete began a few months later with The Tomb of the Cybermen, and continued in the familiar pattern that had been set for the missing episodes. And if we're releasing completely existing stories now, why stop at the black and white era? John Pertwee stories first appeared in the range in the 2006 Christmas box set Monsters on Earth, a collection containing the 3 Silurians and Sea Devils stories from the original series. The Silurians, along with later releases The Ambassadors of Death and The Mind of Evil, were all stories that would require more restoration work than most before they could be released on DVD, so it only made sense for them to be released on audio in the meantime. The Monster of Peladon release was also notable for reinstating a deleted scene, not as an extra, but as part of the episode. On DVD, that would probably be a step too far, but on audio, it kind of worked, and it would have been interesting if, had the range continued, we could have had expanded versions of stories that we know have many deleted scenes still in existence. But sadly, it wasn't to be. Following the release of The Ambassadors of Death in 2009, the range took an abrupt and unexpected hiatus, and in 2010 BBC Worldwide sold an 85% share in the BBC Audio range to Audio Go. The Doctor Who titles would still be released through Audio Go, more than ever before in fact, but the narrated episode soundtracks had now taken a back seat to the new kid in town, complete audiobook readings of the Target novelisations. As this new range became more and more popular, more and more of the narrated soundtracks began to go out of print, and many people who had missed the initial releases were now having to pay more than double the original price in order to fill the gaps in their collection. Thankfully, AudioGo began to address this problem in 2010, with re-releases of the missing episodes soundtracks across 5 box sets with between 4 and 6 stories in each. However, these new editions weren't cheap, and the impression was that once they were gone, they were really gone. The new sets also featured several new exclusive bonus features, as well as a completely new edition of the Macro Terror narrated by Annika Wills. This was a welcome addition, since the original CD release of the story had simply reused Colin Baker's narration from the old cassette release rather than record a new one, and as a result this story had stuck out like a sore thumb in the line for a very long time. These re-releases were great news for people who had missed out first time round, but for those of us who already had everything, well, we still wanted more. And in 2012 we got more, with releases of 4 Tom Baker stories. These didn't seem to be as well received as the previous audios, and it's hard to pin down an exact reason why, since it was pretty much the exact same team doing the exact same thing that they've been doing so well already for 10 years. Maybe the Tom Baker stories of the late 1970s are more visual than the dialogue-heavy missing episodes of the mid-1960s. Maybe the audience really wasn't there for these releases anymore, especially considering the much wider range of Doctor Who audio releases since the show had returned to TV. Maybe releasing audios of existing episodes within just a year or two of their DVD release was lowering sales. Or maybe people just missed the beautiful voice of Peter Purvis. I don't really know. Sadly, these Tom Baker releases were to be the last new narrated soundtracks. In 2013, AudioGo suspended operations and went into administration. More than 50 people lost their jobs, and many BBC audio titles became suddenly unavailable. Among the Doctor Who range, the main casualties were the new missing episode box sets, some of which hadn't even been out for a year by that time. Thankfully, most of them are still available as downloads, but if you want a physical copy, you'd better be prepared to pay at least double the original retail price to get it. Or even more. Although Random House took over the BBC audiobooks range from AudioGo, many titles drifted out of print, and certain upcoming projects also fell into permanent limbo. Rumour has it that Planet of Giants was planned for release in 2009 and The Web Planet for 2014, but nothing ever came of either. In fact, the Web Planet listing is still on Amazon, waiting patiently for an update that will probably never come. And that was it for the narrated soundtrack range. Since the fall of AudioGo, there's been very little activity beyond a couple of notable re-releases. Recently, 2 box sets collecting most of the narrated soundtracks of stories that exist in their entirety were released. Surprisingly, because you'd think that those would be a lesser priority than keeping the missing episodes in print, since the existing episodes, well, exist. And earlier this year, both Tomb of the Cybermen and City of Death were released on vinyl for Record Store Day 2018. I went looking for these. I couldn't find these. Congrats to anybody who managed to get these. Now, there are several people that we really need to mention when we're talking about this range, people without whom these CDs would not have been possible. The most important of all are the dedicated fans who actually recorded these episodes on audio when they were initially broadcast. People like David Holman, Richard Landon and particularly Graham Strong, who connected his recorder directly into the back of his television in order to capture the soundtrack in original broadcast quality. It may have seemed like an unremarkable thing for them to be doing at the time, but if they hadn't made those recordings, then all of the so-called missing episodes really would be completely missing.
And that's the original tape. That's 45 years later, nearly 50 years later. Oh, terrific.
But these recordings vary in quality, sometimes even across the space of one episode, and with so many different sources available, how do you decide which one to use? Mark Ayres had the unenviable task of selecting the recordings and cleaning them up for release. I couldn't begin to tell you how he goes about doing that because it's far too technical for me, but very few people could bring the level of dedication to this task that he did. To say it's a difficult job doesn't even begin to do it justice, but the results speak for themselves. Now, once we have all these episodes cleaned up and ready to go, the next thing we need to do is to get somebody to write a narration script, and considering what you're looking to narrate doesn't actually exist, that can't be an easy job. Several people covered scripting duties on the narrated soundtracks. Mark Ayres, David Darlington and Andrew Pixley all did a few. David Darlington also produced the range, and Andrew Pixley contributed introductions and production notes for almost every single release. Robert Ayres and John Molyneux wrote the bulk of the scripts for the soundtrack releases of the existing episodes. Michael Stevens did sterling work adapting many a missing Patrick Troughton six-parter. But by far the busiest of all these writers was Sue Cowley, who wrote narration scripts for 17 releases, including the very first, The Massacre. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that the success of this range is in no small part due to Sue's work in establishing a clear and effective format with those early releases. Now, I'm not saying that nobody else in the world could have done that, but the fact is, she did do it, and she did it very well. The best testament to the skill that she brought to that job is the fact that if you compare her narration scripts to the missing episodes that have been recovered since the CDs were first released, there's very little difference between what you see on screen and what she guessed was there based solely on scripts and telesnaps. It's almost as if she knew. Almost as if she'd seen them before. Almost as if she was hoarding them. No. And also, we mustn't forget Max Ellis, who created some rather wonderful and slightly garish covers that perfectly capture the tone and mood of the stories. And lastly, we mustn't forget the narrators who brought those scripts to life. Some people questioned why it had to be somebody who acted in the original production that got to narrate these, but to me, it's a no-brainer. It's all about immersion. You want the new narration to fit naturally, not bring the listener out of the story for even a moment, and who better to do that job than one of the actors who appeared in it? All of the actors involved with these releases did a terrific job, but some were used more often than others, so it's no surprise that I tend to favour those more than some of the ones who only did 1 or 2 stories. In particular, William Russell and Peter Purvis's narrations of most of the Missing William Hartnell stories are just pitch perfect, and it's a joy to listen to them even if they're narrating a story that isn't all that great.
The Doctor emerges from the Rill Centre and turns to help Vicky out.
Well, come on, we'll make it.
But an iron grill slams down in front of her, blocking her exit.
Doctor!
I can't move it. It's immovable.
So does the narrated soundtrack range have much of a future? I don't know. I know better than to predict what the BBC is going to do. Personally, speaking just for myself, I think it's unlikely we'll ever see any new narrated soundtracks. I hope I'm wrong, I really do, but it just seems like something they're not interested in anymore. I do think that if they gave it a try, released the Planet of Giants or Web Planet audios that may or may not have been recorded, they might be surprised at how popular they would be. I can completely understand why people are sceptical about continuing this range, about releasing stories on audio when the DVDs are right there. After all, we live in a very different world now to the one we did in 1999. When this range first began, Doctor Who was still being released on VHS, and DVDs were only just creeping onto the market. Today, in 2018, we have everything there is to have on DVD, and people aren't so attached to physical media as they once were. And never mind downloading audio episodes to your phone to listen to on the go, you can download video episodes to watch on the go. Back in 1999, that was simply unthinkable. But remember, Doctor Who fans are completists. We love having full sets of everything, and we were so close to getting a complete run of 1960s Doctor Who on one format for the very first time. Over the 50 stories produced between 1963 and 1969, all but 14 of them were released as narrated soundtracks. Just 3 more releases and we would have had the whole Patrick Troughton era complete. We got that close! Also, plenty of time has now passed since the DVDs were released. That situation where you'd buy a narrated soundtrack of a story that would come out on DVD just a year or so later, that doesn't exist anymore. So are you seriously telling me that you wouldn't be interested in hearing William Russell narrate the Dalek invasion of Earth? Peter Purvis narrating the Time Meddler? Fraser Hines narrating the War Games? My personal narrated soundtrack holy grail was to get a release of my favourite story, Inferno, narrated by either Caroline John or Ian Fairbairn, both of whom are sadly no longer with us, but Christopher Benjamin could do it. But if nothing else, how about getting that Annika Wills version of the Macra Terror out again in some form for those of us who didn't need to buy the box set it was released in? Seriously, it's not even available to download since AudioGo collapsed. What's going on there? As for the missing episode audios, I would be very surprised if they remained out of print for good. I could definitely see them being re-released in a few years' time, particularly now that they're fast approaching the end of the Target Books range. Some of Doctor Who's very best stories are included in the missing episodes range, and they deserve to be kept on store shelves just as long as the DVDs and Blu-rays of existing episodes are. Whether or not we see any re-releases or new releases, there's no denying the fact that the narrated soundtrack range did what it set out to do. In the space of just 7 years, every single missing episode of Doctor Who, over 100 of them, was made available on CD. That is an extraordinary achievement, one that I doubt anybody was really expecting when the range first started. Remember, all this had been tried before and had failed before. There was no reason to believe the range would cover all of the missing episodes, let alone a sizable chunk of the existing ones. But to me, these audio releases were a hugely important development in the history of the show, just as important as the videos or the DVDs or the Target books. They opened up massive chunks of the show's lost past that until now many fans had never experienced, and made it accessible to a much wider audience than any reconstruction would ever have been able to. Different people have different preferences when it comes to experiencing the missing stories. Some people adore the telesnap reconstructions, some people will accept nothing less than full animations. I know some people even prefer the Target novelizations to many of the TV stories they were based on. But for me, these narrated soundtrack audios are the definitive way to experience the missing episodes of Doctor Who. I'm so grateful to everybody who worked on these for producing such a great product. I still listen to them all the time, and if ever the range resumes with more brand new narrated soundtracks, I will be the first to get a pre-order in. The Massacre soundtrack, the one that started it all, will be 20 years old next year, and I think that's definitely an anniversary to celebrate. Make it happen, BBC. Make it happen. Starting with Inferno.
Come along, my dear. It's time we were off.